I'm going to share with you the social principle. Just a second, let me share my screen. Can you see that?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Great. And I've seen the faces of the people online, and we have some wonderful, wonderful people online. So I'm looking forward to this session very much. Now, I'm hard of hearing, so I've been having to work hard to listen to people. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. If you can't, just raise your hand. So we live in a different world from the world that established the social creed in 1908 and the social principles that we presently have in 1972. We live in a world that, even viewed from above, looks different depending upon which way the planet is rotating and where you take the picture. That means that we not only live in a new world with new understandings, but we also live in a world in which the perspectives with which we look at it change constantly. And so the time has come for new social principles. And that's what we're going to be talking about now. Jason, could you help me get rid of this bar that seems to be in the way no matter where I put it?
That's part of it.
I've got to just bring it. So it's
Oh, that's okay. That's good.
okay, you did it. Yay, thanks so much. So that the very process of doing the revised social principles was a search for paths to the future. And I'm going to say more about what those paths were, because the paths themselves were very significant. Oh, and now I'm getting, it's not moving. And I click. Wow.
There you go.
Right, we'd be in trouble without Miracle Man here. Thank you, Jason. One critical path toward the United Methodist Church renewal and social mission is the social principles. The emergence of this project was simultaneous with a lot of other projects in the UMC. The Global Book of Discipline, for example, that received a lot of attention a few years ago. And all of the conversation about who will we be, will we split, will we not split, and so forth. All of that was simultaneous. So the timing for this was very good for the church. We're dealing here with a Christian with a history that goes far back. It's very long into the past, and it's very far into the future. But Jesus, let's start there, was a healer of people with mental and physical illnesses and all kinds of other problems. Jesus was also a witness to social justice. I think about the money changers in the temple. Jesus was also a disruptor of equity. I gave the wrong example there. The witness to social justice would be Jesus calling on the crowd and challenging them, if they are themselves blameless, to go ahead and throw the first stone at the woman caught in adultery. Jesus was also a disruptor of economic abuse. Think of the money changers in the term. So Jesus was himself a social radical in his context, as well as even today in our context, as we think about his ministry. Jesus also declared a social principle. Jesus did that more than once, but I'm going to just use one example. When the lawyer came to him, challenging him about what's the greatest commandment, his response was to love the Lord your God with all your heart and soul and strength. I actually originated heart and soul and mind, and then Matthew added and strength. And the second is like unto it, to love your neighbor as yourself. I want to suggest that that's a social principle.
Mm.
And that stands at the heart of what we're doing with our revised social principles. These are not a book of laws that tell you what to do in every situation. They are guides, but they are also guides that come out of one core. And one way of naming that core would be the Great Commandments, loving the Lord our God with all our heart, soul, mind, and strength, and loving our neighbors as ourselves. Jesus' principle was intended to guide both individuals and communities. And his own principle was rooted in Hebrew scripture. So what I just quoted, as you all know, came directly out of Hebrew scripture. He simply lifted them up in his ministry, and they were lifted up in the gospel stories. These teachings have guided the church for more than 2,000 years now in our ministries of healing, housing, giving to the poor, caring for the forest, and developing more just social structures. You can find examples in the Middle Ages of bishops guaranteeing the protection of a particular forest, for example. You find almshouses that date back to the 1st and 2nd centuries of Christianity, and so forth. These were not invented by Christians, but they were practices that were engaged by Christians frequently, and with a recognition that they were following in the guidance of Jesus Christ. Now, our legacy also is deep in the Wesleyan tradition. And again, I'm going to name just a few, and these things are going to be familiar to you, but they're very important to understand the underpinnings of the social principles. So John Wesley, for example, preached about people being created in the image of God persistently. This was a major theme in his preaching and in his writing. And by that, he was recognizing the sacredness of all life and the sacredness of every human being. He also had a passion for healthcare, and he wrote Primitive Physics. Well, if you read his Primitive Physics now, it's filled with very interesting medical advice, some of which is actually still relevant, like, wives' tales and things like that. It's kind of funny to read now, but it wasn't funny in those days. The medical profession was just emerging, and it was only for the rich people, and it wasn't all that great in the first place. And so he really gathered together folk remedies and wrote this book for this primary purpose of reaching ordinary people who lived on the edge financially and who couldn't afford medical care and who needed home remedies that might work for them. And so he was a healthcare enthusiast and doer from an early time. That was 1747, by the way, when he published that book. He was also an advocate for people in prisons and for people who lived in oppressive, polluted environments, people who lived near these factories that were beginning to build up. And he did that often by writing letters. He would write letters to the local government about cleaning this up because it was making people ill. So he was an advocate for ecological care as well as human care. And he also established a school. It was intended to be for people who couldn't afford all of the private schools in England, actually called public schools, but not available to the public. And he started a school for the children of his preachers. However, that school, of course, now costs a lot of money to get into. But what is interesting is that movement to provide education for more people led early Methodists to be leaders in the Sunday school movement, which wasn't a domesticated movement at all. It was intended to provide education and activity for people young kids who had to work all week and only had Sundays off, and they were kind of at loss, and that was something that Wesley didn't do, but the early Methodists were the dominant leaders in that movement. So that moves us into the Methodist movement. Now, in the Methodist movement, I'm going to jump to 1908, when the Methodist Episcopal Church North established a social creed. This was the first social creed initiated by a church in the United States, perhaps the world. It was the first one in the United States. And the creed called for equal rights and complete justice for all men, sorry about that, in all stations of life. It was the first denomination to do this. It focused a lot on poverty and workers' rights, worker justice. But then soon after, the Methodist Episcopal Church South followed suit, as did the Methodist Protestant Street. Methodist Protestant. So these big Methodist movements in the United States just took off in the early 20th century. In 1946, the EUB created such a statement. And so when the EUB and what was then, by then, the Methodist Church merged in 1968, sorry, they needed a new social principle that would represent all the bodies that were joined together. And they created a set of social principles that were approved in the 1972 General Conference. And then in 1976, they were amended and passed again. So we're still living with the 1976 social principles.
Oh, wow.
I've given you those dates because I want you to realize we're talking 50 years later. So we're in a good moment of history to take a good hard look at those social principles. And any of you who've ever been to General Conference knows that they get fixed up at every General Conference. We have many petitions come in and many additions, modifications, and so forth. So they not only date from 76, but they've been amended all over the place. So that, for example, the social principles are a little bit messy. Human rights, for example, appears in 3 of the present 6 sections of our social principles. So there's a lot of duplication and stuff like that, and a lot of unclarity, so that people recognize that perhaps it was time not only to clarify, but much more importantly, focus the social principles so that they could be genuine guides for the church, study guides, preacher inspiration, and so forth. So we've come this far by faith. The General Conference of 2012 recognized the need to take a good look at the social principles, and they passed. And I don't remember if it was a resolution or a petition, but they passed a ruling that we would enter into a revision period for the social principles that would last 8 years, and the leadership of that would be delegated to the General Board of Church and Society, which is where it landed. And GBCS was excited about this. They wanted to jump right in, which they did. The revised social principles were not intended to be a list of rules, but they were intended to be taken very seriously as guides to the church's social witness, its mission. And therefore, this was an important moment of recognizing that we needed to take a look so that we were supporting a church in which every relationship, ecological, economic, social, political, was supported to represent the love and grace of God. And now you'll notice an occasional slide that I borrowed from the Holy Church and Society's website, but they've done some nice slides. So this is one of them. This has been an 8-year journey, and I've added the words sea change here, because these are not just a newly decorated, newly edited, but these are really newly conceived social principles that have sought to bring the best of our past, to bring it into a clear focus, and to make it something that would have a great meaning for the church. And so this is one of the slides from GBCS that I find particularly helpful in describing the process. So you start on the left with General Conference 2012. And what did they do? They didn't just say, go revise the social principles. They had three demands. One, they wanted social principles to be more succinct. And two, they wanted them to be theologically grounded. I changed their wording. Oh, well. And thirdly, they wanted it to be based in global relevant principles. I'm going to say more about that in a moment. So what did they do at the very beginning? They hosted hundreds of focus groups all over the world, in every central conference, in every jurisdiction, and in a great many annual conferences and meeting congregations. Just an explosion of focus groups. And they produced a notebook about this thick with everything that people had said. And they were asking people, what do the social principles mean to you? What would you like to see them contribute to the church in the future? And so forth. And they had all of this volume of stuff. So then when we moved into the second phase, which was creating writing teams, that was when the writing teams are the overarching team was given this fat notebook. I was chair of the writing and editorial team. And I can tell you, we read every word.
Wow.
Not every writing team read every word, but we read every word if we were part of that leadership. And then we had 52 writing teams around the world. Most of them were themselves representative of different regions of the world, different ethnicities, different perspectives, and so forth. And these teams the leaders of the teams came together, and we trained one another. Then they went out and did their work, and they brought back their proposals, and they were quite amazing. And already at that point, we're bringing forth things that no one of us would have ever thought of. No dozen of us would have thought of, because they were coming from everywhere. And then following that was the editorial team work, and we had a smaller team of about 8 people who worked, 6 people plus incredible staff who worked together in trying to edit. And that's when we faced these challenges of being succinct, theologically grounded, and truly global. Because, you get all that input that I described, and you've got a lot of stuff. And so we worked together not only to bring together everything we had heard, but to produce a first draft, send it out to the church, get survey responses, then produce a second draft, send it back out, get responses, and then produce another draft that we worked over for months, because this was a very important thing to do. And in that process, you can imagine, we didn't get succinct very fast. We could trim this and that, but we kept adding things too. And so that was a challenge, but it was a really good challenge, because when you bring human rights from 3 sections and try to put them together in one section, you begin to see what the real heart is. And that becomes clearer, and you can communicate it more clearly in that kind of thing. So then, of course, it went to the Board of Church and Society, and they approved it overwhelmingly. And with, I think, maybe 2 negative votes, it was a very small number of votes that were in opposition. But then, of course, it was all ready to go to General Conference, and General Conference didn't have it. So it was postponed, and now it's coming in 24. But I want you to know, this is just important, I think, for you to hear, is that we got more than 4,000 responses. I'm not talking about those early stages. I'm talking about responses to the drafts and to the focus groups we then did after the drafts. And we read every word. And there were 2 of us on the team who did thematic analyses so that we didn't lose any major themes that were named by people in the church. And then when there was a perspective that was not part of the mainstream responses, we took that into consideration and we reflected deeply on that as well. So every response was really received, heard, and responded to, so that the document we prepared was a true reflection, the best we human feeble beings can do to reflect the church as a whole. And I'm going to say something about, I'll give you some examples of that. So we had the listening groups. There's one of them in the Philippines. And then we had the crafting and revising, which I've explained, with the writing teams, consulting groups, survey. And I want to add one thing here. There were a few times, many times, when we realized, we haven't heard anything from this central conference. Or we haven't heard anything from this jurisdiction. Or we've heard from a lot of men in Africa, but we hadn't heard from very many women, and so forth. And so what did we do? We would just get the networks moving, and we would ask some of the women's groups in different central conferences in Africa, could you get together and reflect on these and make your suggestions back to us? That made a huge difference. And there were so many examples of that. So many churches and individuals took it on themselves to jump in with the surveys and to give response. And if there was any part of the demographic that was missing, we would tap in and find ways to get some responses from them. So one of the questions that is often asked is so did we fulfill our goal? Well, I'll let you, the goal that the General Conference had set for us, I'll let you figure that out as you work on these social principles. But I do want to say how we tried to fulfill it, what we did to fulfill it. In terms of theological grounding, we spent a lot of sessions doing biblical study. And we spent a lot of sessions reading and reflecting on John Wesley's writing and on Charles Wesley's hymns, less so, but we did some of that too. And John Wesley's actions. We did lots of study. You're not going to see footnotes here. You're going to see a phrase or a sentence, maybe 2, but you're not going to see all of that footnote. But it all went in and it affected the wording. And you'll see things like doing as Wesley did and blank, blank, blank. And that was out of study. We also wanted every part of this to reflect the larger Christian tradition and the Wesleyan tradition. And we hope it does. Succinct, I've already said something about that. I will say that we went from having 6 sections in the social principles to having 4. I'll say more of that. In terms of reflecting the worldwide communion, being global, I've already described what we did, and we got so many suggestions. Let me give you 2 examples, which I find stunning. One example is that we wanted, and our little editorial team, to stay silent on polygamy. because it's a controversial issue. And also, we had one African in the group, and we had some people who were international, but most of us were from different parts of the United States. And we did not want to do the big US colonizing thing. So we thought we should leave that. We contacted many groups across Africa on that one, and they said, you must put something in about this. And they not only advocated that we take a stand against polygamy, but they wanted us to add something that would say that if in the case where polygamous relationships already exist, that the church should reach out and care for the entire family. And if in fact one of the women gets dismissed, because most of the polygamous relationships are male with multiple wives, if one of the women gets dismissed, the church should make sure that they don't get cast out and that they're cared for spiritually and physically. That's one example. Another example is suicide and euthanasia. And the stance of the church has been, and it is in this document, that we don't condone suicide and euthanasia. But we learn from some people in some parts of the world that in fact, often suicide is seen as such an evil act that the whole family of the person who's committed suicide is cast out of the church and is denied relationships in the community, ostracized. The person who's committed suicide is not allowed to be buried in hallowed grounds. So we added something about that. So we were discovering all along that there were unique perspectives coming from different people. Let me show one other one. And that is that we have a lot in our present social principles about trafficking. And we also have a lot about the rights of women and girls. And in the trafficking section, that section was intended to be, it was focused almost entirely on women and girls, are a big part of it. And we were advised to remember that men get trafficked too. And we did not add that there, but we did modify the language so that it said sometimes the people who traffic are, and it did name women. But then when we came to a section on women and girls, and another part of the social principles, men individually and in men's groups came and said, wait a minute. If these things are important for women, they're also important for men. So we now have two sections, one on women and girls and one on boys and men. Now you notice that's not dealing with other gender identities, but that shows you something about the process and how we kept getting stretched as we were hearing back from the church. I want to compare the outlines because I think that is truly edifying. On the left, you'll see the outline for the present social principles. On the right, you'll see for the revised. The present social principles has the natural world. We kept that basic category, but we changed it to community of all creation. I'll come back to this. The present social principles have two categories, the nurturing community and the social community. We combined those because they had a lot of repetition. This wasn't just an editorial thing. This had to do with the fact that we didn't see the closer knit nurturing communities as unrelated to the larger society and vice versa. So we put them together and call them the social community. The economic community remained as a separate section. The present social principles have two other categories, the political community and the rural community. And here we realize that not only did the rural community repeat a lot of things that were other places, but more importantly, if we saw ourselves as a worldwide community, why do we separate global community from everything else? Because it's part of everything in the social principles. So we combine rural community with other sections so that the rural community is represented throughout. Those are some of the major changes, and it shows some pretty big shifts in the thinking of the church. We're not just a church with a global outreach or global extension, like we're a U.S. church with all this global relationship. We're a global community. And I now want to walk you through these a little bit more, but I'm not going to give a whole lot of detail. The revised social principles now has a category of community with all creation. You realize how that's different from the natural world. Mm-hmm. The natural world doesn't really deal with the fact that human beings are part of the natural world. Mm-hmm. And it deals with, here are the ecological ills, and we're called to be stewards and to care for the earth. But that suggests a kind of othering kind of relationship. Uh-huh. But if we're really caring for the natural world, we recognize that everything in the natural world is caring for everything else. Uh-huh. The ants are communicating to things to forests so the trees know when danger's coming, and the trees can prepare. The rivers and lakes are there to be and to share the waters of the earth with everything that is. And so we are not only tenders of the rivers, but the rivers are tenders of us. So this idea, focusing all four sections on community, is a recognition that our social principles are grounded in community and covenant. So that is one of the shifts. I put this out of order a little bit. So the next section is really economics, but I'm going to skip to the social community. Here in this slide, the emphasis on racism, ending racism, ethnocentrism, and tribalism. You notice this runs through this whole section. You notice we're not using just one word. If you use racism, the Germans will say, wait a minute, we tried to get rid of race consciousness because of what happened during the Holocaust. So race is a problem word. It's a hugely important word in other parts of the world. And in some parts of the world, the issue is tribalism. So we tried to use language that represented some of the differences here. But this part on social community also has a lot to say about human relationships, familial relationships, single people, people who live in all different lifestyles. And the sexuality stuff is here. And interestingly enough, the major protests that I've heard so far, and I'm not representative of the whole church, but the major protests come from people who say, well, can't we put back in the language of marriage is between one man and one woman? That's often the first place people go when they want to complain about the revised social principles. We were seeking a language that had meaning for people of faith in committed covenantal relationships. We were seeking to put the accent on the covenantal relationship and not on the gender identity or the sexual orientation. And that was a big toss for many in the church. But of course, we got some feedback that was more smaller, and some even in the when the thing came up for a vote in the GDCS board meeting, the negative votes were because they wanted to add this back in and then board decided not to. But like I say, the negative votes were few. So this will surely come up in general fund. On that particular subject, but really on the whole thing. The board is hoping that these social principles won't get chopped up and dealt with as 100 different pieces. They hope, I hope as well, we hope that they will be dealt with as a whole. So the wholeness of them can carry the day. And so far, I think that may well work. I'm sure that they'll get amended. That happens for general funds. But the hope is not to do a lot of tinkering on these, but we see them as a whole, knowing that we'll be revising these social principles should they pass for the next 50 years or until another sea change takes place. The economic community, that very strong emphasis on ending poverty and income inequality. And political community deals with justice issues within the larger political sphere. It also has a major section on human rights. So that's where you find the human rights social principles. Your turn.
I have a question.
Oh dear, I use all my time. No, I think we have 8, 9 minutes.
I just have a question.
Yeah, you have 6.
So you mentioned about the changing the definition, well, not changing, but making the definition of marriage more adaptive, more open. Did you get any pushback when you were preparing this from people who thought that we'll take out the incompatibility language, like that homosexuality is incompatible with Christian teaching, because it's not there anymore,
We were all clear that we didn't want it.
including Central Conference participants?
That was interesting. I want to get the language, but
Yeah.
that was interesting. The writing teams did not favor keeping that language. And that included Central Conference. The Central Conferences are the delegates to these writing teams and the editorial team were not banner wavers for a particular issue. They were wanting to look at the whole. And so they did not isolate even that issue. And at the same time, they recognized that within the Central Conferences, they have the freedom to do things differently from other places. And they also know that the social principles are not legally binding law. And so they, I can't get into the full psychology, but we did have some negative response from some of the Central Conferences, Cote d'Ivoire for one. But we didn't have a huge amount. We mostly had enthusiasm because it was more representative of
Everybody else.
of them and their values, is what they told us. Now, we did sometimes get a barrage of emails on one subject, and that was one of the subjects that usually came from certain wings of the church. You know, you could kind of tell when an email had been sent out and encouraging people to send responses in. Because you get a barrage on a particular subject with a particular view. But that was not the name, which was fine. I mean, that's exactly what we wanted. We wanted to hear everybody. But we didn't get that from the Central Conference.
Okay, thank you.
There were plenty of people who did not want that language to be removed, but there were not, but the numbers were much smaller of those who wanted that to be a major issue.
Because I'm not hearing that even now. From the conversations with Central Conference folks, or delegates, nobody's talking about the incompatibility language. they're talking about marriage. So it's very interesting.
That's fascinating to me because it's consistent with our experience.
Yeah.
And every one of us on the editorial team could say honestly that we're not 100% satisfied with every word in this document. This doesn't represent, because if we had to be, we'd have 5 or 10 different documents. But we tried not to seek compromises, but to seek negotiated centers, to see what's the heart here and how do we express the heart, and do it in such a way that difference is still allowed. I'm fascinated by that.
Yeah. Because we gathered we were in Johannesburg in April, Dar es Salaam in Tanzania this January, we were in the Philippines in November. And I'm not hearing anything about, oh, the social principles took away the compatibility clause, which we call it, right? But they're talking about marriage.
So, let me read you the first couple of paragraphs here, they're short.
The one where you took it out, what does it sound like now?
We took it out, but our approach was to try to find a positive way to talk about marriage rather than to just
No,
make it an either or. Let's fight the negative language. So here's the first paragraph. Within the church, we affirm marriage as a sacred, lifelong covenant that brings two people of faith into union with one another and into deeper relationship with God and the religious community. While the United Methodist Church does not recognize marriage as a sacrament, we celebrate and cherish this as an expression of the couple's faith, grounded in their relationship with God and one another. So that's how we try to approach it. Any other comments or questions or concerns? I appreciate your listening. And my hope for these social principles is that they will pass, but even more important than that they will become a part of our church's ongoing meditation, study, preaching, discerning. And my hope is that they will be truly, truly valuable as we all try to live Christian lives. Thank you.
thank you.